How should historians go about doing their work? That's the question for this episode of Theories of History. Hi there, I'm Jostein, and in this video I'll be discussing a letter by the German historian August Schlözer from 1783 entitled On Historiography. I've put a link to the letter in the description below. Schlözer was an historian, and a whole lot of other things, who lived in Germany in the second half of the 18th century. When it comes to theory of history, Schlözer was clearly ahead of his time, for his letter contains an exemplary description of the dominant historical method of the 19th century, which we today know as historicism. The pretext for Schlözer's letter was an essay by a French historian by the name of Mably, entitled On the Manner of Writing History. In many ways typical of its time. We won't go into detail about the contents of Mably's essay, but according to Schlözer, Mably prioritizes wrongly by valuing the presentation of history over its truthful content. Mably's heroes are the classical historians like Xenophon, Thucydides, and Livy, who were masters of creating both entertaining and educational stories of the past. Schlözer contends that it's time we turn our heads towards the future instead of the past for our ideals, since modern historians are both more critical and better equipped than their predecessors for the job. They will therefore have a better chance of writing truthfully about the past, which is what history is all about. Historians should leave off trying to be painters of history, as Schlözer pejoratively calls it, and endeavour instead to be writers of history. But this requires an enormous job of gathering facts about the past and critically evaluating the truth contents of the historical sources. This is not the job for one man alone, it requires a collective effort. In my conception, historiography in its totality is like a large, infinitely complex factory where 100 master craftsmen of totally different trades, assisted by 1,000 labourers, must closely cooperate. Schlözer goes on to describe this grand enterprise of future historiography and the different tasks involved. He focuses on two main functions, the history collector and the history researcher. The task of the history collector is to know all the facts, without exception, on a given subject, for instance Charles the Great, and of course this means to know the sources available in all extant languages. He must then extract and compile those historical facts without omission so that the reader can find the smallest detail, like the spelling of a name, by consulting the compilation. All these facts must then be arranged in chronological order, and in this way the reader will have a complete overview over all the historical facts about a given subject. Although this is a daunting task, Schlözer sees this as doable for a diligent and learned person, like a monk or a nun. Whereas the main task of the history collector is to collect historical sources, the history researcher should primarily evaluate the sources. This is to be done by making critical editions of ancient manuscripts, which often exist in several differing copies. The history researcher should be asking questions like, does this word appear in all the copies? Where the copies differ, which one represents the original text? Are these texts genuine or pseudepigraphic? Etc., etc. Schlözer admits that a single critical edition of this sort might take a lifetime to complete, but he really walked the talk himself and spent years preparing a Russian medieval chronicle in precisely this way. After all this preparatory work has been done, then comes the time for the historiographer, and his job is to extract the relevant sources for the topic he is writing about from the work of the history collector and the history researcher. He will use only what is relevant for his paper, leaving anecdotes and miraculous tales, which ancient histories are so full of, completely out. After all this is done, and numerous exact and truthful reports about the past in this way have been completed, then could come the time of the historical painter, whom Mably was so fond of. He would have grown up reading nothing but truthful histories, not fancies, and his job would then be to present the accounts of the historiographers to the larger public, combining presentability with truthfulness. In his letter, Schlözer no doubt foresaw the future of historiography for the bulk of the 19th century, but more importantly, his vision implies a redefinition of what history is all about. Gone are conceptions of history as an account of great deeds, a guide for moral life, pleasant reading and good entertainment, which had all been so integral to history ever since antiquity. For Schlözer, history is one thing, and one thing only: the truth about the past. And Ranke's famous description of history as the past as it really was simply a later reverberation of Schlözer's ideas. But before his program materialized in the era of historicism would come the time of Hegel and metaphysical philosophy of history. During that time, history would be seen as needing philosophical interpretation to make sense. And after historicism, history would once more gradually return to the understanding that there is more to history than simply being a truthful account of the past. But this is all food for future videos, and for the era of historicism, Schlözer's ideas reigned unchallenged. That's all about Schlözers on historiography. If you'd like to watch more videos about theories of history, I hope you subscribe so we can see each other again soon.